Aidan Lowell had never been the kind of man who blended quietly into any setting. At 6'3", with weather-beaten hands and a deliberate gaze, he carried himself like someone who measured every moment twice before reacting. He wasn't loud, but he was present, and when he arrived in the coastal neighborhood of Blackstone Edge, hauling with him a flatbed truck loaded with steel beams, polycarbonate panels, and crates labeled Soil Culture Experimental, it didn't take long for residents to notice. He hadn't chosen this sleepy stretch of shoreline for the sea breeze or for retirement. He'd chosen it because it was the only place he could build exactly what he wanted without anyone breathing down his neck, or so he thought. The house he purchased was old and brittle, a 1940s colonial relic with salt-worn siding and rusting gutters. Most would have torn it down or flipped it into a beach rental. Aidan did neither. Instead, he gutted the interior, reinforced the foundations, and turned the backyard, a patchy, sloping lot bordered by cedar trees, into the stage for a structure no one in Blackstone Edge had ever seen. A glass house shaped like a geodesic dome, 3 meters tall, with an irrigation system he designed himself, relying on rain capture and solar-filtered condensation. The neighbors stared as the frame took shape, some with idle curiosity, others with restrained contempt. But Aidan didn't look back. He had left behind a former life too public, too political, too compromised by academic cowardice and corporate pressure. Now he simply wanted a space to work with his hands, to rebuild something that felt untouched by public agendas and performative ethics. He hadn't come here for war, but war, like mold in a garden, has a way of blooming exactly where you least expect it. He finished the greenhouse in early April. Inside, it was a riot of green. Climbing cucumbers with spiraling tendrils, marigolds planted deliberately along the floor's edge as pest deterrents, and in the center, the true heart of his work, pumpkins. Not just any pumpkins, but cultivars Aidan had been hybridizing for over 7 years, long before he resigned his post at the university. These weren't built for Halloween or pie. They were sculptural in form, dense in texture, bred for carving and longevity. His late sister, a botanist who had once called them vegetable busts, had started the line before her accident. Now Aidan continued it, year after year, not out of sentimentality but because their existence gave him precision and peace. Something about watching them swell and thicken under controlled conditions steadied his nerves in a way therapy never could. The day the last piece of glass was installed, Aidan invited no one. Instead, he stood in the center of the dome with a mug of black coffee, listening to the gentle whir of fans, watching condensation slide along the panels. He felt no triumph, only readiness. His new life had begun. But peace, it turned out, had a very short lease in Blackstone Edge. He first encountered Karen Wilkes on a Tuesday morning in mid-spring. She wore tailored linen slacks, wedge heels completely impractical for gravel, and a white visor that cast a surgical shadow over her face. She didn't knock on his door. She waited just beyond the edge of his lawn, arms folded, one foot tapping like she was conducting an invisible interview with the air. When he approached, towel over his shoulder, sweat still clinging to his brow from morning maintenance, she didn't introduce herself so much as announce her role. "I represent several of the property owners here, Mr. Lowell," she said, skipping past pleasantries like they were optional. "There's been some concern about your installation." "My installation," Aidan repeated, not correcting her mislabeling of the greenhouse. "It doesn't conform to the visual unity of the neighborhood. We have a certain harmony here. Cedar fencing, terracotta tones. Your structure doesn't blend." "I didn't realize the neighborhood was a gallery," he replied, not unkindly. Karen didn't smile. She opened the folder she'd been clutching and revealed a printed aerial map with color-coded overlays. "We've drafted a preliminary plan to bring the community aesthetic back into alignment. I'm hoping you'll voluntarily adjust your design." Aidan didn't touch the folder. I'm not part of any architectural board, Karen. And this structure is on my private property, within permitted setback, elevation, and height requirements. That's not in dispute, she said smoothly, her voice too calm. We're speaking about community standards, not legal ones. I wasn't aware those were mutually exclusive. They are, she said, when one lives among neighbors. That, Aidan thought later, was her thesis statement. Not a threat, not even quite a demand, just an assertion of her worldview, stated with the clarity of someone who had never had to negotiate for space in her life. She didn't argue. She simply assumed that consensus would form behind her, and it did. In whispers and nods, in cold shoulders and side glances at the corner store. Aidan didn't get hate mail, but he noticed how the older couple across the street stopped waving, how the teenage boys who used to ask him about solar wiring now averted their eyes. Someone, somewhere, had given them a script, and it started with silence. He ignored it for weeks, focusing instead on tending his garden and refining the greenhouse's nutrient cycle. But passive pressure soon evolved. One morning, a painted stone appeared beside his mailbox. Green doesn't mean good. A week later, he found a paper slip under his windshield wiper, a photocopy of an EPA citation, redacted and labeled for inspiration. Not once was Karen's name mentioned, but her style was all over it. Curated. Intimidation, veiled behind civility and plausible deniability. Still, Aidan didn't bite. He could withstand passive-aggressive suggestion. He could endure the bored disdain of over-invested suburban stewards. But the moment that made his jaw clench came on a Monday evening when he found one of his pumpkins. Not damaged, not stolen, but turned. Someone had entered the greenhouse without force, rotated the heaviest specimen so it faced the wall, and left. No vandalism, no signature. Just quiet, deliberate rearrangement. It felt surgical, intimate, like someone had whispered over the plants while he slept. The next morning, he installed motion lights and trail cameras. He updated his perimeter locks and shifted the glasshouse schedule so that lights now illuminated its interior from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m., revealing silhouettes to anyone watching from the street. He didn't confront Karen. He didn't submit counter-notices. He simply grew quieter, more methodical. The community wanted symbolism. He would give it to them. By midsummer, the pumpkins had taken on grotesque beauty, bulbous and wrinkled in ways that almost resembled flesh. Aidan, without speaking a word to his neighbors, began carving. Not jack-o'-lantern style, but something far more deliberate. He studied faces. He used clay tools and scalpels and tracing lights. The first one was a generic expression. Lips pursed, brow furrowed. The second bore a crooked half-smile that looked disturbingly familiar. By the third, the resemblance was unmistakable. The pumpkin had Karen's face. He didn't place it at the front. He didn't show it off. He nestled it into the inner ring of the greenhouse, just behind the marigolds, visible only if you knew where to look. He said nothing, but someone saw it, and that was when things stopped being quiet. It wasn't the pumpkin that broke the silence. Not directly. In the logic of Karen Wilkes, confrontation was rarely reactionary. It was staged. Something about the presence of her likeness, sculpted in vegetable form and hidden behind marigolds like a grotesque shrine, must have disturbed the hierarchy she'd spent years cultivating. Not because it embarrassed her, embarrassment implied vulnerability, but because it mocked the unspoken agreement she believed she had with the neighborhood, that her aesthetic authority was never to be challenged, and certainly never parodied. She didn't knock on Aidan's door. She didn't file a complaint. What she did was simpler and more insidious. She began to restructure the environment. It started with a letter slipped through every neighbor's door, sealed in a parchment-colored envelope stamped with a custom wax insignia, a monogrammed KW encircled by laurels. Inside was an invitation, handwritten in fluid blue ink, to a gathering of minds regarding residential stewardship and the preservation of neighborhood integrity. No mention of Aiden by name, no images, no accusations. Just a casual line. It has become apparent that individual projects may inadvertently shift the tone of our shared space. The message was unmistakable. Aiden wasn't simply seen as unconventional. He was seen as corrosive. The gathering took place 2 weeks later in the backyard of the Wilkes residence, where folding chairs were arranged in concentric semicircles like some suburban senate. Photos of Aiden's greenhouse printed on glossy paper were pinned to a corkboard beside images of traditional backyard designs. Symmetrical hedges, beige siding, conservatively paved walkways. Karen gave a brief, pleasant-sounding speech about continuity of atmosphere and the importance of maintaining visual rhythm. The crowd nodded. Someone asked about Aiden, finally, timidly, and Karen responded with the kind of practiced neutrality only true manipulators master. This is not about any one person. This is about shared values. Aiden hadn't attended. He'd received the invitation. He read it while sipping coffee and filed it along with everything else in a folder marked Performance. But that weekend, he began noticing changes around him. Neighbors who once ignored his greenhouse now began deliberately landscaping with plants Karen had recommended. Identical white lavender rose, identical terracotta planters. Even the paint on some shutters changed within days, shifting toward the same muted coastal palette Karen had once championed in a local architecture blog. It was less about style than conformity. Aiden understood the message. You don't have to leave. Just shrink. Then came the second incident inside his greenhouse. This time, it wasn't rotation. It was absence. He walked into the dome early one morning and immediately sensed it. One of the pumpkins, the third, the one with the distinct tilt of Karen's jawline, was missing. No signs of forced entry. No shards of broken glass or scratched locks. Just absence. He searched the perimeter, checked his cameras. Nothing. The feed from the night before had cut off around 2:47 a.m., static filling the frame for 13 minutes before it resumed. It wasn't a glitch. Someone had used a jammer. He didn't panic. He documented. He printed stills, made a copy of the interrupted feed, and logged it alongside notes. Then, calmly, he posted a small hand-painted sign inside the greenhouse near the remaining pumpkins. Please do not touch the work. It is still forming. He didn't expect a response, and none came publicly. But 3 days later, during a stormy evening when the sky rolled black over the ocean and power lines swayed like ropes, he found a package left on the bench near his back door. Waterproof, unmarked. Inside, wrapped in plastic and bound with twine, was the stolen pumpkin. But it had changed. Its face had been altered. Someone had carved deep vertical gouges into the likeness, warping the mouth into a gaping oval. The eyes had been widened unnaturally. The neck had been crushed as if the whole thing had been gripped violently and twisted. No note, no fingerprints, just the reshaped object, saturated with rot at the base. Aiden burned it in his fire pit that night. Not out of fear, not out of anger, but because the act required closure. He watched the skin blister and peel, the flesh collapse in on itself, the face blacken into a melted parody of expression. Then he swept the ashes into a steel tin and placed them on a shelf in his shed. Everything, even threats, would be categorized. After that, the attacks grew bolder, but never direct. He returned home one afternoon to find all his irrigation timers reset. Someone had entered the greenhouse without triggering any alarm, tampered with the nutrient schedule, and left undetected. Several plants began to wilt. He had to scrap 2 hybrids. At the same time, a notice arrived from the zoning department. A formal review of his structure's compliance had been scheduled, in response to anonymous concerns regarding reflective glare and water runoff. He contacted his legal advisor, a meticulous woman named Dara Feld, who reviewed the documents and replied with a single sentence: "They're baiting you into procedural panic. Don't bite." He didn't, but he adjusted. The dome's panels were replaced with anti-glare coating. He installed a secondary set of internal locks, not visible from the exterior. He had his electrical lines rerouted, his solar system recalibrated with backup fuses, and the exterior of the greenhouse re-landscaped in a less abrasive arrangement. He even allowed Dar to file a notice of documented interference with the local sheriff's office. Not as a complaint, but as a future-proofing gesture. But he didn't stop carving. By mid-June, there were 5 new pumpkins, all in various stages of anatomical abstraction. Only 2 bore faces. One smiled, the other didn't. He never displayed them publicly, but he knew word had spread. Someone had leaked a photo from the first public tour he'd hosted. A neighbor's kid, maybe. It appeared on a gardening forum under the title Suburban Gothic. Comments speculated wildly. One claimed it was performance art. Another called it a passive-aggressive lawsuit in progress. But one comment stood out to Aiden. It read, "This is the most elegant threat I've ever seen." He screenshotted it, printed it, taped it to the inside of his shed. Karen didn't mention the pumpkins again. But one morning, Aiden found a flat gray rock placed in front of his greenhouse door. Painted on its surface, in neat capital letters, was the phrase, "You're being watched." The paint wasn't sloppy. It was symmetrical, balanced, a composition. He left the rock where it was. 2 days later, it disappeared. And on the same day, he received a notice from his home insurance provider. His policy had been flagged for reassessment due to potential high-risk installations on the property. It wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. Economic suffocation disguised as policy adjustment. But Aiden didn't react the way she expected. He printed his policy. He rewrote his contingency plan, and he planted more pumpkins. Not in the greenhouse this time, but outside, lined up in the backyard like silent sentinels, their skin darkening with rain and wind, their forms thickening into brutal silhouettes. He didn't carve them. Not yet. He simply let them grow, under the wide gray sky where everyone could see. The shift from passive pressure to active interference wasn't abrupt, and that was what made it more disturbing. It crept in, like moisture under a foundation, slow, untraceable, and undeniable once the cracks began to show. Aiden noticed it first in the air, a kind of tension that clung to the mornings, heavy and expectant, like the weight that settles just before a thunderclap. His property, once surrounded by casual silence and the low hum of coastal wind, began to hum differently. The pattern of motion changed. People walked their dogs on the opposite side of the street now, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Cars slowed as they passed the greenhouse, not out of curiosity, but assessment. Conversations and driveways paused when he emerged to check the compost bin. He wasn't being excluded anymore. He was being surveilled. Then came the smell. It started faintly, just outside the greenhouse, somewhere between sweet rot and chemical burn. A smell that didn't belong in his soil, didn't match any decomposition profile he knew. At first, he thought something had gone wrong with the compost mix or a dead animal had gotten into one of the open beds, but the odor didn't behave like decay. It came and went, sharper at night, sometimes disappearing entirely, then returning with doubled potency. He dug into the beds, tested pH levels, isolated soil samples, and still found nothing abnormal. Then, one night, long after dusk, he stepped out to retrieve a rake he'd left by the fence and saw it. A thin line of powder scattered deliberately across the border of his back plot, like someone had tried to sow salt into the earth. Not enough to destroy, just enough to send a message. He bagged it, labeled it, and handed it to Dara the next day, who had it tested. The report came back 4 days later: calcium cyanamide, a soil additive that, in improper amounts, can ruin root integrity and cause burns to seedlings. It wasn't illegal, but it was deliberate. That same week, he found nails scattered across his driveway. Not spilled randomly, but spaced like caltrops, each one rusted to blend with the gravel. It wasn't enough to puncture tires outright, just enough to cause slow leaks, frustration, fatigue. Aiden responded by installing an underground driveway camera and replacing his gravel with large-cut stone, removing any concealment options. He reinforced the motion sensor range around his greenhouse perimeter, upgraded the trail cameras to dual band, and installed a floodlight system that activated not with movement, but with thermal patterns. Less prone to false triggers, more difficult to bypass. His back fence, which had been simple post and beam, was replaced with corrugated steel backed by brush. The aesthetic didn't match the neighborhood, but that was the point. It wasn't for blending anymore. It was for holding. Karen didn't escalate in the way one might expect. There were no confrontations, no yelling across the fence line, no notes taped to doors. Her strategy remained composed, bureaucratic, performative, surgical. Aiden received an official letter from a law firm 2 towns over, citing increasing neighborhood complaints regarding unapproved visual installations, disruptive lighting, and unauthorized agricultural activity. The phrasing was clinical. There were no demands, only requests for voluntary resolution in the interest of community cohesion. It was signed by a junior partner with a signature too neat to trust, and included a line suggesting ongoing documentation and witness statements had been collected. Aiden handed the letter to Dara without reading it twice. She chuckled humorlessly. "This isn't a lawsuit," she said. "It's leverage. She's trying to bait you into saying or doing something impulsive. Stay precise. Stay boring. But precision has limits when provocation becomes physical." One morning, as Aiden walked the back edge of his property, inspecting the outer trellis near the composting zone, he stepped on something soft. Not soil, not plant matter, but a mass. Pulling his foot back, he saw it. A mound of raw animal intestines laid in a loose coil beneath a layer of mulch. No carcass, no blood trail. Just organ meat, chilled but fresh. It hadn't come from scavengers. It had been placed there. Nearby, a broken ceramic tag, the kind used on pets, lay half buried. The letters too charred to read fully, but the word "beloved" still visible. The implications were as grotesque as they were calculated. Aiden didn't know whether it had come from Karen herself or one of her sympathizers, but the message was clear. Intimidation was now part of the neighborhood's aesthetic. He called the police, made a formal report, documented the site, and demanded a trace on the ceramic shard. The responding officer, a stocky man in his 50s with the resigned tone of someone used to suburban theater, took the photos, nodded sympathetically, and said he'd keep it on file. Aiden saw the look in his eyes. Not disbelief, not dismissal, but fatigue. These things never escalated enough to matter, never clear enough to prosecute, never obvious enough to classify as criminal. Just low-level corrosion, persistent and deniable. But Aiden had seen systems rot from the inside before. He'd watched universities, corporations, even city councils disintegrate under the weight of petty vendettas dressed as policy. He wasn't naive enough to think Blackstone Edge would be different. That night, he changed tactics. He didn't retaliate. He didn't post about it. He didn't speak Karen's name. But he did expand the pumpkin line, not just in volume, but in content. Instead of faces, he began sculpting postures. Curved backs, collapsed shoulders, twisting necks. The pumpkins became torsos. Headless, expressive, architectural. Their forms lined the path toward the greenhouse, increasingly abstract, increasingly human. At the center, where the air was warmest and the soil most fertile, he planted a hybrid vine known for irregular growth patterns, a genetic oddity with unpredictable curves and dense internal structure. The cultivar had no name, only a lab number, P35KR09. He began feeding it differently, not with nitrates but with composted floral matter, coffee grounds, and eggshells. It responded rapidly, thickening, rising like a spinal column wrapped in green flesh. Within weeks, it became the largest specimen he'd ever cultivated, taller than his waist, veined like marble. He didn't carve it. He simply let it grow, untouched, untitled, facing the gate. Meanwhile, Karen struck with her most theatrical move yet. A new initiative appeared in the neighborhood, an outdoor art harmony project, announced via printed flyers left in mailboxes, co-signed by 5 residents, none of whom Aidan had ever heard speak in public before. The initiative proposed voluntary alignment of outdoor displays with community heritage themes, including suggested palettes, plant types, and structures inspired by the coastal origins of Blackstone Edge. The language was soft. The pressure wasn't. Each flyer included a QR code to report discordant structures anonymously, with a note that submissions would be reviewed by a rotating panel of neighbors. It was crowdsourced aesthetic policing, neighborhood surveillance disguised as community engagement. Aidan didn't flinch. He took a copy of the flyer, framed it, and placed it on the greenhouse door. Then he carved one more pumpkin. Not a face this time, not a body. It was a map. He sculpted the street layout of Blackstone Edge, each house marked by ridges and valleys. His own house was the centerpiece, not larger, not exaggerated, just geometrically accurate, and beside his property line, etched with surgical precision, he carved the words, "This is still mine." He left it unlit. He left it unguarded. By morning, it was gone. But in its place, someone had left a single rose, wrapped in a plastic sandwich bag, the kind children use for lunch. No note, no blood. Just a flower, perfectly preserved, leaning against the glass. Aidan stood there for a long time, watching its petals tremble in the morning breeze, and then, quietly, went back inside to sharpen his tools. There was a specific silence that settled over the neighborhood after the map pumpkin vanished. Not the absence of sound, but a kind of collective breath-holding, as if everyone waited to see what would come next and who would act first. Aidan felt it in the way people drove slower past his house, not because they were cautious, but because they were watching. Even the wind seemed to carry differently, swirling around the greenhouse like it avoided the glass. Days passed with no new incidents, no new provocations, and that was precisely why Aidan didn't trust it. He knew from experience that moments of quiet and conflict weren't peace, they were strategy, pauses designed to let the opponent reveal his rhythm. But he had stopped playing by theirs. He diverted his attention into logistics, not emotion, not theory, but paperwork, infrastructure, documentation. The soil contamination reports had come back inconclusive, but the chemical trace matched a supplier that only sold to registered agricultural vendors. Dara reached out, requesting transaction history under the Freedom of Information Act. She didn't expect cooperation, but she knew how to phrase a letter so that ignoring it came with its own consequences. Aidan, meanwhile, compiled everything. Photos, timestamps, schematics, incident summaries. Not because he intended to file a suit, but because he had learned that a man with an archive has leverage, even in systems that pretend to be impartial. The moment someone tried to erase him from the neighborhood story, he would have a complete version printed, bound, and press-ready. But beneath all the documentation, something else shifted. For the first time since arriving in Blackstone Edge, Aidan noticed something approaching. Not support, exactly, but hesitation. At the market, a woman he recognized, she lived 4 houses down, always silent, caught his eye while bagging apples and nodded, not warmly but with something close to recognition. The next day, he found a note in his mailbox, unsigned, written in square, neat letters. "I know what she's doing." You're not imagining it. He didn't know who had written it, but he recognized the weight behind it. Someone who hadn't dared speak, but needed him to keep going. Not for solidarity, not for victory, but so they didn't feel entirely alone. That mattered more than any legal win. Then the story broke. Not publicly, not in the press. Aidan had no interest in headlines, but in a closed community forum where local realtors shared notes on properties, aesthetics, and livability metrics. A screenshot found its way to Dara, a conversation thread, discussing his greenhouse as a deterrent feature for future buyers on the block, complete with a photo of his carved pumpkins labeled aggressive decorative choices. The final comment in the thread stood out. It read, "If this kind of thing spreads, the whole coast will tip into chaos. We need structure." The post had come from a user called K. Wilkes Edge. Dara printed the screenshots, highlighted the usernames, and smiled like a surgeon preparing for incision. "She's gone digital," she said. "That means she's overconfident. Let's shift the tempo." She suggested they request a third-party survey of Aidan's property, citing the ongoing anonymous complaints to formally establish boundary integrity and compliance with coastal water regulations. Not because they needed to. Everything had already been filed and cleared, but because requesting it publicly would appear cooperative, even proactive, and any resistance from Karen or her allies would now look obstructive. Aidan agreed, and the paperwork was filed that same day. While the inspection was pending, Aidan made one final modification to the greenhouse. Not structural, not defensive, but symbolic. He installed a narrow walking path, paved with reclaimed slate, leading from the gate directly to the greenhouse entrance. At the center of the path, just before the dome's threshold, he embedded a plaque, a flat copper plate etched with a single phrase. "If it offends you, then it's not for you." He didn't announce it, he didn't invite attention. He simply let it be discovered. The response came not with confrontation, but with cold logistics. The very next morning, an envelope appeared tucked into the doorframe of his greenhouse, sealed with gold foil, no return address. Inside was a formal invitation. Blackstone Seasonal Garden Tour, a long-running neighborhood event that celebrated curated private gardens. The invitation included a note. Your participation would demonstrate goodwill and an interest in integration. It was not a peace offering. It was a challenge wrapped in etiquette, a polite dare to subject his space to curated judgment. He accepted immediately. And then he prepared. He didn't alter the pumpkins. He didn't trim the vines into polite geometry. What he did was clean. He swept the path, polished the glass, adjusted the lighting to illuminate the interior in warm amber between the hours of 6 and 8 in the evening. He printed informational tags for each plant, described their origins, their pollination behavior, their soil preferences, and for the carved sculptures he labeled them Study in Organic Form, Untitled. Nothing was sarcastic, nothing was defensive. Everything was professional, polished, and presented with the calm confidence of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove. On the day of the tour, his property was the third stop on the walking map. Visitors came in 2s and 3s, sipping white wine from plastic cups, pretending not to whisper as they moved through the dome. Some blinked in surprise. Others leaned in toward the sculptures with discomfort they tried to mask as curiosity. A few muttered phrases like bold or unexpected, or, in one case, a little intense. No one confronted him. No one applauded. But no one turned away in disgust either. And that, for Karen, was the real loss. He had neutralized her narrative, replaced it with ambiguity, and forced people to choose nuance over alliance. Karen didn't attend the tour herself. She sent her assistant, a tight-jawed man in a navy sweater vest who refused to make eye contact, but her absence spoke volumes. By the next morning, the real estate forum thread had been updated. Subject property demonstrates non-traditional aesthetic but has attracted significant regional attention. Property value no longer considered diminished. May attract buyers from niche creative industries. Aidan read the post over breakfast and didn't smile, but he did allow himself a single breath of clean, uninterrupted air. Not victory, not yet, but stability. And for the first time in months, he stepped outside with no tool belt, no camera, no clipboard, just a rake, a basket, and the knowledge that they'd have to do a lot more than whisper and sabotage if they wanted to uproot him. The summer that followed the garden tour was anything but calm. Aidan had hoped the tacit acknowledgement of his greenhouse's place in the neighborhood might settle things, at least for a while. But what came next was a tempest of carefully orchestrated pressure, designed not just to unsettle, but to break. The battle had shifted from subtle intimidation and veiled threats to direct assaults masked by a veneer of legality and social order, a kind of psychological warfare that preyed on bureaucracy and whispered rumors. It began with the arrival of official notices. One day, while tending to his prize pumpkin vines, Aidan found a letter taped to his greenhouse door, stamped with the seal of the local zoning commission. The letter informed him of an imminent inspection to review his property's compliance with community environmental and structural ordinances. The language was neutral, almost polite, but the implication was unmistakable. The neighbors had initiated formal proceedings. This time, the complaints cited concerns about excessive water runoff, unpermitted electrical installations, and potential pest infestations. The timing of the letter, just days after the garden tour, made clear that the inspection was not coincidental. Aidan responded by engaging a civil engineer friend from his university days, one who specialized in environmental compliance and sustainable design. Together, they conducted a thorough review of the greenhouse's water systems, electrical wiring, and pest control methods, documenting every detail with precision and certifying that the structure met or exceeded all municipal codes. The engineer drafted a report, complete with schematics and soil analyses, which Aidan submitted to the commission well before the scheduled inspection. This proactive step, while prudent, did not deter the proceedings. When the inspectors arrived, they came not singly, but in a group of 3, a zoning officer, an environmental specialist, and a representative from the local health department. They were meticulous, checking every pipe, scrutinizing the electrical panels, measuring runoff patterns after recent rain. Aidan observed calmly, answering questions with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his property intimately and understood the rules. After 2 days of thorough evaluation, the inspectors left without comment. Days later, Aidan received their official report, a list of minor infractions, mostly technicalities involving paperwork that had been overlooked, accompanied by an order to rectify these issues within 30 days. Among the directives was a demand to remove a series of rainwater barrels deemed not up to current health standards, a requirement to install additional fencing to prevent wildlife intrusion, and to submit a detailed landscaping plan aligning with neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. The letter was signed by the zoning officer who had attended the inspection. Aidan recognized the tactic immediately. These demands were designed not because they were necessary, but to create frustration, bureaucratic burdens, and potential community alienation. He reached out to Dara, who reassured him that these were common pressure points used in neighborhood disputes. "They want you tangled in red tape," she explained. "The goal is to wear you down financially and emotionally." While Aidan set about complying with the requests, consulting with vendors for fencing and rainwater systems, updating paperwork, he noticed a more covert form of escalation unfolding. Simultaneously, one morning, the pumpkin vines that had been thriving suddenly exhibited signs of severe distress. Leaves curled and yellowed overnight, and the stems bore suspicious scorch marks. Testing revealed traces of a corrosive chemical, likely applied in diluted form to avoid immediate detection. This wasn't the first time his plants had been targeted, but the precision and timing were escalating. Recognizing the severity, Aiden contacted a local agricultural extension office, where a specialist agreed to assist in analyzing the damage and monitoring for future threats. They installed soil sensors and recommended specific nutrient treatments to aid recovery. The extension specialist also helped Aiden document these incidents for potential legal use. As if orchestrated by a conductor behind the scenes, social pressure mounted. Karen, though absent in person, deployed her network with precision. The neighborhood association's newsletter, usually a benign monthly update, suddenly featured editorials about preserving the coastal charm and responsible stewardship of our shared spaces. The language was loaded, carefully omitting direct references but thinly veiling criticism of unconventional structures and non-compliant landscaping. Karen's fingerprints were unmistakable. The writing style, the selective quotes from neighbors, the subtle but pointed calls for voluntary conformity. Aiden's neighbors, many caught between admiration for his resilience and fear of reprisal, began to distance themselves further. Invitations to social events dried up. Once friendly greetings became curt nods. Some who once supported him quietly confided in him about fear of losing their own standing. The isolation was palpable. In response, Aiden deepened his resolve. He hosted small educational workshops inside the greenhouse, inviting local students, botanical enthusiasts, and members of the community interested in sustainable gardening. These sessions were informal but informative, demonstrating the scientific underpinnings of his work and the environmental benefits it offered. The events gained modest traction, attracting attention beyond the immediate neighborhood. Articles in regional publications praised his innovative approach to urban agriculture, and invitations to speak at local environmental groups followed. This growing visibility, however, only intensified the backlash. One evening, while returning home from a workshop, Aiden found his driveway blocked by an unmarked white van. The occupants watched silently as he approached, then swiftly exited, leaving behind a defaced garden gnome painted with crude caricatures resembling him and Karen, locked in an eternal glare. Nearby, spray-painted words on the driveway spelled "intruder" in harsh black strokes. Aiden photographed the scene and reported the vandalism to the police. The law enforcement response was procedural, but limited. With no witnesses or surveillance footage, the investigation stalled quickly. This impotence underscored a larger problem. The conflict was no longer just personal, it was institutional, embedded in the social fabric of the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the zoning commission's deadlines loomed. To comply with fencing demands, Aiden contracted a local carpenter known for unconventional designs. Together, they devised a fence blending modernist elements with native flora, a barrier both protective and aesthetically mindful. He negotiated permits, secured materials, and supervised installation meticulously. Each post and panel represented not just physical protection, but a statement. He would not be easily removed or silenced. The rainwater barrel issue proved more complex. While he sourced health-compliant containers, Aiden petitioned the commission for a variance, presenting data on water conservation benefits critical in the increasingly dry coastal climate. His appeal gained traction with environmental groups, who provided letters supporting sustainable rainwater harvesting. The commission delayed final judgment, but the process consumed time and energy, keeping the conflict alive in official channels. Amid this bureaucratic warfare, Karen escalated social tactics. Invitations to neighborhood meetings became platforms for thinly veiled denunciations, with her allies questioning Aiden's commitment to community values and transparency. Rumors circulated that Aiden was obstructing progress and hiding violations. The atmosphere grew toxic, conversations turning whispered and suspicious. Aiden's response was steadfast and measured. He engaged a public relations consultant to help craft clear, fact-based communications to neighbors and stakeholders. Flyers explaining the greenhouse's environmental benefits and compliance status were distributed. He also held open days, encouraging community members to visit, ask questions, and see the project firsthand. The turnout was mixed, but for the first time, some neighbors voiced quiet support publicly. In the face of escalating intimidation, Aiden also took steps to safeguard his personal well-being. He began therapy sessions focused on coping with chronic stress and conflict, practices that included mindfulness and boundary-setting techniques. Dara facilitated connections with legal aid organizations specializing in property rights and environmental law, preparing contingency plans for potential court battles. The turning point came unexpectedly on a humid August night. Aiden's security cameras captured footage of 3 individuals approaching the greenhouse. Their faces obscured by hoodies and masks, they moved with practiced stealth, carrying spray cans and a bundle of fabric. They tagged the greenhouse glass with slogans, "Eyesore," "Conform or Leave," and an especially cruel caricature of Aiden himself. They draped a large banner depicting a distorted pumpkin with a scornful face, unmistakably Karen's, over the dome before retreating. Aiden awoke early the next morning, reviewed the footage, and called the police immediately. The incident was classified as vandalism and a hate crime, escalating its seriousness. Community leaders condemned the act in local news, and some residents expressed solidarity with Aiden for the first time openly. Emboldened by the support, Aiden organized a neighborhood meeting, inviting residents to discuss the future of Blackstone Edge. The event was tense but productive. Karen attended, but for the first time faced direct questions about her methods and motives. The dialogue exposed fractures within the community, revealing allies and dissenters on both sides. Though the conflict was far from resolved, this gathering marked a shift. The residents of Blackstone Edge began to grapple with deeper questions about identity, belonging, and the meaning of community. Aiden's greenhouse was no longer just a structure. It was a symbol, a catalyst for change and confrontation. Throughout it all, Aiden's carved pumpkins stood silent sentinels, their twisted forms bearing witness to a battle fought not only in soil and glass but in the hearts and minds of those who called this place home. The stakes had grown higher, the costs more personal, but so had his determination. He was no longer merely defending a greenhouse. He was defending his right to define his own space in a world that increasingly sought to dictate conformity. The attack on the greenhouse, though not physically destructive, marked the most significant psychological escalation yet. It wasn't just graffiti or a midnight prank. It was the culmination of months of pressure, an act meant to publicly humiliate, to strip the project of its dignity and reduce it to spectacle. Aiden stood in front of the tagged glass at sunrise, the words still glistening wet under the morning dew, the distorted caricature of himself smirking back at him through crooked paint strokes. The banner with Karen's likeness, strung with zip ties across the dome's upper curve, rippled in the breeze like a flag planted on conquered territory. But Aiden didn't remove it immediately. He stood and watched, not frozen, but deliberate, taking in every angle, every detail, letting it register fully. Then he returned inside, brewed his coffee, and began writing. Not a complaint, not a blog post or email, but a public statement. Not emotional, not defensive. A structured, precise, open letter. The letter was released online later that day through the community board and his project's website. It was titled, Conformity, Expression, and the Responsibility of Place. In it, Aiden detailed the evolution of his greenhouse, its environmental mission, its compliance history, and the ongoing efforts to create educational access. He acknowledged the conflict directly but without venom, referencing organized campaigns of pressure and anonymous tactics designed to diminish civic participation. He included the vandalism footage, blurred for privacy but clear in its implication, and concluded with an invitation. A community night, open gates, no speeches, just lights on in the greenhouse, the door open for anyone willing to enter and see for themselves what had been so violently opposed. The date was set for Friday. He named the event Evening Among the Growth. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some praised the tone, calm but unyielding, transparent but not accusatory. Others accused him of stirring division, of weaponizing victimhood, a phrase Karen herself allegedly used in a private message that inevitably leaked. Flyers promoting the event were torn down in some blocks, while new ones appeared in others, hand-replicated by anonymous neighbors. Online discussion flared, including on regional forums and environmental groups who had been following his project. He received emails from former students, strangers, even a few journalists, though he declined all interviews. For him, this wasn't about media. This was about reclaiming space. Physical, emotional, communal. The night arrived. By sunset, warm light spilled from the greenhouse, casting golden shadows on the freshly swept path. Inside, the carved pumpkins, restored, polished, rearranged, were illuminated from within, glowing softly through their contorted expressions. Aidan didn't address the visitors. He greeted them politely, offered water, pointed them toward the botanical guide handouts, and stepped aside. He let the space speak for itself. Dozens came. Some stayed briefly, walking through in cautious silence. Others lingered, asking questions about the plants, the sculptures, the methods behind the soil systems. One older man asked quietly, "How do you keep everything alive with all this going on?" Aidan replied, "You protect the roots. Everything above ground is temporary." Karen did not attend, but her absence was noted. More than that, it was felt. And perhaps that, more than any confrontation, signaled a shift. The next day, a new thread appeared on the neighborhood board. Anonymous, but authored with the clarity of someone who had remained silent for too long. It detailed Karen's manipulation of zoning channels, the campaign against Aidan, and the misuse of community funds for aesthetic enforcement initiatives. Though it cited no names, the content was irrefutable. Screenshots, excerpts from internal emails, even a draft of a petition that had never been made public, all uploaded and verified by a moderator. The post went viral within the neighborhood. Within hours, an emergency meeting of the association was called. At the meeting, held in the local community center, Aidan remained seated in the back row. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Others did. One by one, neighbors, many who had never publicly supported him, expressed concern, not just about Karen, but about the culture of fear and compliance that had been allowed to take root. A few admitted they'd been pressured to sign complaints. Others confessed they'd participated in anonymous votes simply to avoid being targeted next. The momentum shifted tangibly in the room, the silence breaking not like glass but like soil giving way after too much pressure. Karen, cornered but not crumbling, responded with characteristic polish. She denied wrongdoing, framed her actions as protective, community-minded, and pointed to her years of service. But the tone had changed. Her words no longer anchored the conversation. Her influence no longer shaped its trajectory. A vote was proposed, a formal audit of her role and actions within the association. It passed with a narrow but decisive margin. The following week, a letter of resignation circulated from Karen's office, citing emotional strain and a desire to focus on personal matters. Her properties remained, but her presence diminished. The network of passive intimidation she'd nurtured began to wither without her daily maintenance. Those who had relied on her social gravity either receded or adapted. The neighborhood didn't transform overnight, but the pressure loosened palpably. Aidan continued his work, not triumphant, but restored. He expanded the greenhouse's public hours, introduced a seed exchange initiative, and began mentoring local students interested in urban agriculture. The pumpkins remained, but new forms emerged. Herbs in suspended pods, vertical tomato lattices, even a corner for insect pollinator habitats. His work evolved, but the sculpture remained central, not as protest now, but as reflection. He carved a final piece that season. Not a face, but an open palm, fingers curled slightly inward, as if holding something fragile but alive. The greenhouse no longer stood in defiance. It stood in affirmation, a reminder that roots once deep enough can withstand storms designed to tear everything above the surface apart. Autumn arrived in Blackstone Edge with a soft shift in light, the sun dipping lower with each passing day, casting elongated shadows that stretched across driveways and fences like fingers too tired to hold on. The air had cooled, not sharply, but with enough intent to signal that things were changing, and for once it wasn't just the season. The noise that had once defined the neighborhood, subtle jabs disguised as conversation, surveillance masked as civility, tension humming behind every trimmed hedge, had dulled into something more tolerable, something that resembled ordinary life. Karen Wilkes, still occupying the stately house across the street, had receded into a silence that was not exactly defeat, but certainly not command. Her name no longer opened doors or closed meetings. Her lawn remained manicured. Her porch light flickered on at the same times each evening, but the pulse of control, the practiced performance of neighborhood stewardship, had disappeared. She didn't host anymore. She didn't call for votes. She had become background. People spoke of her in past tense even though she was still there. Aidan watched it happen with the quiet attention of someone who had stopped expecting closure and instead found value in continuation. He had made no formal announcements after the association's vote, no social media declarations or follow-ups to the open letter. He didn't need to. The space spoke for itself now. Visitors still came, not in crowds, but consistently. Curious residents from nearby towns, small school groups, even a few local artists. The greenhouse had settled into its new role. Not a symbol of defiance, not even a monument to resilience, but a living, growing space that had earned its right to exist without explanation. Inside, the carved pumpkins had begun to soften as the season progressed. Some were replaced, others left to decompose naturally, their wrinkled faces folding inward, becoming part of the soil. Aidan let them go without ceremony. The figures had served their purpose. They had carried weight when it mattered, and now deserved rest. In their place, new forms took shape. Climbing beans woven into lattices of reclaimed copper, rows of lettuce in hydroponic towers, flowering herbs in recycled glass containers suspended by braided steel wire. The space evolved, not for trend or spectacle, but as an organic response to what the land and light allowed. The sculpture he had carved last, a single open hand, remained at the center, half enshrouded in vines, not demanding attention but never quite disappearing. Occasionally, someone would ask what it meant, and Aidan would say nothing. It didn't need explanation. Those who understood already knew, and those who didn't never stayed long enough to matter. His days grew simpler again, structured not by conflict, but by cultivation. Mornings were for maintenance, midday for study and experiments, evenings for walking the perimeter with a flashlight and a notepad, not in paranoia anymore, but in quiet habit. The routines that had once been protective became peaceful. He still kept records, still documented every shift in soil, every change in bloom, but not out of fear. He had learned that archiving wasn't just a defensive act. It was preservation. It was memory made tangible. Neighbors waved now. Not all, not always warmly, but enough. Some asked about planting tips. A few even asked if they could volunteer. One woman brought over her teenage son and explained how he wanted to study horticulture after visiting the dome. Aidan said yes without hesitation. He started drawing up plans to build an annex on the side of the greenhouse, something modular that could serve as a small classroom or workshop space. He funded it himself, quietly, refusing outside sponsorship. If there was one lesson the past year had carved into him as clearly as any pumpkin, it was this. Ownership matters. Autonomy matters. Not for ego, but for survival. By late October, the annex was half complete, and the greenhouse glowed in the early dusk like a lantern tucked between trees. A quiet testament to what could be built when someone refused to yield to the quiet machinery of erasure. Aidan didn't mark the one-year anniversary of his move to Blackstone Edge. No dinners, no tokens,